Honesty is underrated. No, I'm not just talking about, what we talk to our children about, and that is, make sure you always tell the truth. It's easy to say that when we're talking on the surface. It's easy to say that whenever we're wrestling with things like, did you throw the toy or not? Did you hit that car or not? It's easy for us to talk about honesty in contexts that are primarily on the surface. But it is much more difficult to have the discipline and to value being honest with what is happening in ourselves under the surface, behind our actions. Actually pulling back the veil to see why we are doing what we are doing, not just whether or not what we are doing is right or wrong. This comes from a reflection on James chapter 4. James, even though it is considered just a letter of the New Testament, James is basically like the New Testament book of Proverbs. It is full of rich and wise ways of living and of understanding why it is that we are living in the way we are. James says this in chapter 4, verse 1. What causes fights and quarrels among you? That's such a good question. In some contexts, the question of why, like in a death, it does not help. But a lot of the times the question why is the pathway to transformation. And what James is asking for here is not just, what are you fighting about? He's saying, why are you fighting at all? What causes fights and quarrels among you? Why do they exist? Why do they bubble up? And then he answers his own question with a question. He says, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? Why do you fight and quarrel? What causes fights and quarrel among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? Isn't there something below the surface? If we're being honest, a lot of the times the fights that we have over, who's going to get to drive the car, or over who is going to do the dishes, or over who did or didn't mess up the schedule, a lot of the times the fights have something deeper that exists within them. Something that is below the surface, that takes a lot of honesty to pull back the veil and to engage. James continues and he says, you desire but you do not have, so you kill. An action that is preceded by something that is deep within. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and you fight. An envious motion inside of us leads to the fight, usually through self-preservation or through a desire to get what you want. He says, you do not have because you do not ask God. You're trying to, like Adam and Eve, take the situation into your own hands. You want something, but instead of talking to God about it and allowing him to expose the internal, you deal with it through external means. He says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. He's saying, here's the problem. You're not being honest. You're not truly wrestling with the undercurrents of your heart that lead to behaviors. You're just focusing on the behaviors. And here's one of the things I found about our behaviors. There is 1,000 ways to justify any action that we do, regardless of how vicious, regardless of how atrocious, regardless of whether or not it even goes against the text itself. Honesty is underrated, but I'm not just talking about whether or not we are lying. I'm talking about that the first person that we deceive in most situations is ourselves. That we recruit ourselves, we evangelize ourselves to become allies with us in our deception. Our deception that a lot of the times buries so deep the desire that is inside of us that led to this moment, to this behavior, to this fight, or to this quarrel. It is buried so deep that a lot of the times we don't even know what it is to be truly honest. You see, the honesty that I'm talking about takes a level of self-awareness that most people simply lack. I was talking to my students about this morning, where I said, if you want to be a good Christian leader, or if you want to just be a good human, you need to learn how to be self-aware, to understand not just what you were doing, but why you were doing it. To learn to embrace the depth of honesty of James 4, verses 1 through 3. To honestly assess why it is that you are angry. And this really hit home for me the other day. The other day, I was going through, every morning I have a similar routine because I like to have everything totally set out and in place. And the reason why is because I have so many other decisions I want to make throughout the day that if I can just not make decisions whenever I wake up, I make sure that my clothes are laid out the day before. I make sure that that my food that I'm going to eat is usually the same. I make sure that the drinks my routine is pretty normal in the morning. It's pretty it just goes straight through. And yesterday morning, there was one little thing that my wife did that threw off my routine. And she wasn't around at the time. It was just something that she said she was going to do and she didn't do. And I had an anger well up in me that I knew was going to lead into a quarrel, a fight, an argument of some sort. And then I began to wrestle with, where is this coming from? I started to realize that one of my earliest wounds, I've talked about this in my book, Between Two Trees, but of being molested, was that this message came to me. That it said, Shane, you're alone. You're all alone. And if you are going to survive, you're going to have to figure this out yourself. Don't rely on anyone else. Matter of fact, isolating what everybody else's emotions, their feelings are away from yourself will be healthy because you have to survive, and taking on their emotions is baggage that can weigh you down. Now hear me when I say, I know that long term that is not healthy. But that's the way I learned to survive from the age of 6 to the age of 39. And whenever my wife left out that one thing in my routine in the morning, it hit me funny where I started to say the message of my own wounds from whenever I was 6 years old to myself again. Shane, you're all alone. If you're going to be able to get your routine, you're not going to be able to rely on anyone else. You have to figure it out yourself. And my attitude changed. The way I was treating people via email, and the way that I was treating people, even colleagues, and then the way in which I even came home or tried to avoid eye contact with my wife. It was because deep down, my desire was not to be alone. My desire was to be a part of something with someone else. My desire was to trust and be able to trust other people. But the problem is that the way in which my wound functioned moved me into a mode of self-preservation that led to behaviors and actions that are unacceptable for a Christian leader. And by God's grace, I had a friend point this out to me in the day. He basically said this, Shane, you're not being honest with yourself. For your actions show that you're fighting for yourself and that there's something deep inside. You need to sit down and wrestle with what's happening in deep inside so that you can take ownership of what it is you're actually doing. Here's my challenge for you this week. Recommit to honesty. Commit to honesty with such a depth that you're not just wrestling with whether or not what you told your neighbor was true or not. Be so ruthless with your honesty that each of your behaviors, positive or good, you are able to look internally and you know why. You know the fount from which it has emerged. You know the well that it has sprung up from. And ultimately, through that self-awareness, you can actually transform your self-preservation into the same sacrifice that Christ himself gave for us on the cross. I love you guys. Have a good week.